Continuing with How the Great Religions Began by Joseph Gaer. Book 3, The Advance of the One God. Part 5, The Reformation, Out of the Dark Ages, or perhaps starting a new Dark Age. Section 6. Before Martin Luther and Sense. Martin Luther was not the first swallow in church history to bring the summer of the Reformation. Long before Luther's break with the Pope, many conditions arose to make a change in the Roman Catholic Church necessary, and many were the people who championed the need of a change. The 14th and 15th centuries are noted for a great awakening from what is known to us as the Dark Ages. This awakening is called the Renaissance. During these 2 centuries, the great universities of Heidelberg, Cologne, Prague, Vienna, and Erfurt were established, and in these universities, the new learning flourished. Istanbul and Timbuktu, after the Crusades, people thought, oh, they got some good ideas. But during the Crusades, they're like, oh, let's ignore this. The new learning flourished. During the Dark Ages, the popes forbade the study of Greek and Hebrew, and they forbade the study of Greek philosophy and the study of classical mythology. But during the 14th and 15th centuries, these studies were revived in the great universities, and the great teachings and literature of the past came to life again. With the study of Greek and Greek history, a new interest in art arose. That encouraged the growth of a great art in Europe, to violate the second commandment in much of its expression. During this time, the great Leonardo da Vinci painted frescoes that we still treasure. Raphael painted his famous paintings, and Michelangelo swung his mallet to leave to the world a heritage in carved stone. While the new learning rumbled like thunder, and the great masters of brush and chisel were hard at work, the news spread from land to land that Diaz, Vasco da Gama, and Columbus had discovered the shores of a new world and a route to India by water. Well, they heard rumors and checked it out. The marvelous discoveries of a new route to India and an unknown continent had not yet been fully told. But when the great Polish physician and scientist Jan Copernicus made his appearance with a few little instruments under his arm and a small book which he had written to prove his discoveries of the heavens, up to that time people believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and that the sun and the moon and stars revolved around the earth to serve it. People call that the geocentric theory. Well, people believe that in Christendom, because we have the flat earth and all that other stuff. Jan Copernicus proved that that was not true. He proved that the earth and the moon and the stars revolve around the sun, and that sun is the center of the universe. This is called the heliocentric theory. From having the most important place in the universe, the earth suddenly dwarfed into an insignificant spark in space, one of many others revolving around the sun. Copernicus's startling theory about the universe made people gasp, and it made them think. In England and in France, and in Italy and in Germany, and all over the civilized world, the bright dawn of the Renaissance stirred people to the thought and action. the civilized world didn't need a lot of these things because they already even had it in their mythology. They didn't need to prove it with science, but this was the time when science was being shown as something different from Christianity in many respects. The great poets and great writers of those days readily enlisted in a courageous army to advance the new learning. At the beginning of the 14th century, the famous poet Dante published a long poem called The Divine Comedy, in which the poet describes an imaginary trip through purgatory, hell and heaven. The guide that leads Dante through hell and heaven is not an angel, nor an apostle, nor a saint, but Virgil, the great poet, a heathen. Well, projecting your hatred of others in the lowest realms of heaven and mosque and of iron and, to us, this may not seem very heretical, but in the days of Dante, to have shown such great respect for a Roman poet was a crime for which some people were burned at the stake. After Dante, other great writers began to praise the philosophy of the Greeks and their mythology and their great literature. With these new ideas coming to life, a change in the religious beliefs and a decline of power of the popes were inevitable. Everywhere, all over Europe, religious reformers arose. The first important preacher of reform was a French merchant named Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo, who lived towards the end of the 12th century, was a very religious, wealthy merchant who undertook the translation of Holy Scriptures into French. And to backtrack slightly, Dante, Milton, other figures like that changed the cosmology of the populace. During his studies of the Scriptures, he became convinced that the Pope and his followers were not living according to the teachings of Jesus. His own life as a wealthy merchant, he realized, was not in accord with the teachings of the gospel. Peter Waldo gave his wealth away to the poor and began to preach the teachings of Jesus as he found them in the New Testament. His sermons attracted a number of people who became his followers and called themselves Waldenses. Waldenses, okay. Maybe that's how it's pronounced. When Peter Waldo died, his where's Waldo? May have been inspired by all this. When Peter Waldo died, his followers carried on his work and tried to spread his teachings, but the Pope prohibited them from preaching and ordered that Waldenses should be persecuted and killed wherever found. But the Waldenses did not stop from spreading their conviction that no one can live the life of a good Christian in luxury and corruption. The Waldenses, followers of Peter Waldo, preached reform in France and in England. Capitalism sort of sprung off Luther, but it wasn't corrupt capitalism like today's gospel of prosperity, that God's pleased with you. Yeah, the Bible talks about not making money with interest and not being drunkards and all sorts of things, but, making money with, God's pleased because you're rich. That, obviously came later and in England. John Wycliffe, a professor at Oxford during the 14th century, arose as an opponent to the Pope's power over England. John Wycliffe denied the absolute infallibility of the popes and criticized many of their practices. John Wycliffe also objected to the sermons and services of the church in Latin, a language not understood by most people in England. Well, the problem was not changing and understanding. Not expressing an understanding. When you just translate, you're automatically going to get some problems. Then people aren't going to know that, this isn't part of the older version, So changes happen over time. like we saw with doctrines that became Christian doctrines after the influence of the Greek variations and Latin variations paved the way to Christianity. He organized a number of priests and sent them out to preach in English. With the help of some of his friends, Wycliffe translated the Bible into English so that all the people could read it and understand it. Through Wycliffe's work, though Wycliffe's work was suppressed in his own country, it found many followers outside of England. It reached Germany and Bohemia and influenced the thinking of many young reformers. Then came Luther and started the organization of the Protestant churches. And at the same time, the revolt against the Roman Church broke out all over the Christian world. Among the important reformers next to Luther, who brought about the Reformation, came Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli, the son of Swiss farmers, was given a good education, and as a young man became a chaplain in the army. After years in the army, he settled in Zurich, where he was offered a pastoral position. For many political reasons, Switzerland of those days was more advanced in its democratic ideas than most of Europe. And Zwingli was permitted to introduce changes into his church that would not have been tolerated elsewhere. His first break with the Roman Church came when Zwingli attacked the belief that the priesthood ought never to marry. At the age of 40, Zwingli married. Now, the Bible says that the bishops, the higher members of the church, initially there were like 7 or something, were not allowed to have more than one wife. But that's the only, And then over the next 1,000 years, we have the doctrine finalized about the celibacy of the priesthood and the nunnery. And, hundreds of years later, you had a virgin birth among the top nun, well, so-called anyways. At the age of 40, Zwingli married. This he followed with an attack on the worship of idols, which led to the removal of all pictures, crucifixes, and images from all the churches in Zurich. No sooner was one of his changes successful than Zwingli induced another. Zwingli was more advanced in his ideas of reform than Luther, and on one occasion, Luther and Zwingli met in a debate in which the two opposed each other bitterly. In the end, Luther was so incensed by Zwingli's ideas that he refused to shake hands with his opponent. Zwingli hoped to organize the Protestants of Europe and to strengthen them through the support of those rulers who were eager to separate the power of the church from the power of the state. Zwingli's hopes were not fulfilled, but in his life, his work, he paved the way for another important reformer, John Calvin. And so, not all Christians are disobeying the second commandment of their 10 commandments. But every single one of these reformers, there's something wrong, and there's problems with them and their movement, because stuff creeps in that is condemned by their own sources. So whether they've made good changes overall, or whether that's left to the side, let God judge that. But the birth of John Calvin in 1509 in Noyon, a little town about 70 miles from Paris, was no great event in the lives of his parents. They had children before him, and they had children after him. But when John was old enough to go to school, his father tried to give his son, together with his other children, the best education to be gotten in their town. If John's mother was not too busy doing other things, She may have counted the buttons on her second son's shirt, wondering what he would be when he grew up. Preacher, teacher, lawyer, writer, court physician, royal scribe, or dean in some great university, or street sweep. Let's not be pessimistic now with our children. Surly John's mother must have expected him to grow up to be something very important, for at the age of 14, John had already exhausted all the learning of Noyon and left for the University of Paris. After 4 years in the university, Calvin had distinguished himself for his scholarship. He kept on studying. He studied religion. He studied law. He studied Hebrew and Greek. He studied the classics. 5 years passed again in studies, and John was still uncertain as to what career to follow, and his mother must have been when she counted the buttons of his shirt, if she did. Then something happened that decided the question of his career for John Calvin. A friend of his, a physician, asked him to write an address for him, and John Calvin wrote it. In that address, Calvin expressed a number of Protestant doctrines. In those days in France, they burned people at the stake for being Protestant, and John Calvin fled from France to Switzerland. 3 years later, when Calvin was still in his 20s, appeared his book, The Institutes, which established him as one of the most important religious writers on Christianity. From then on, Calvin devoted himself to the writing of Protestant works and to the organization of the Protestant Church. He lived almost all his life in Geneva, Switzerland, but his teaching, called Calvinism, spread over Europe and took root everywhere. Calvin personally influenced another church reformer, John Knox. And so there's a certain importance that's in going back to the sources, but forbidding everything new? No, you should source your reasons, or kind of back up your reasons other than something's new, it must be forbidden. In this day and age we've had people, radios are not allowed until people start making religious broadcasts. Oh, must be that God wants us to use the radio and the TV and recording devices and all sorts of stuff. Some guy accidentally farts in church and gets beaten. I mean, what's wrong with you? Knox was a Scotsman who preached Protestantism in Scotland and had to flee for his safety. From his homeland he went to Geneva, and there he became acquainted with Calvin and his teachings. When Knox returned to Scotland, he established a church very much on the Calvinistic order. Excepting for some small differences, his church grew in popularity, and his teachings, called Presbyterianism, later spread and grew into a large sect. Presbyterianism played a very important part in the country of its birth, England. But even before John Knox began to preach reform, a great change had taken place in the church of his land, which is called the Church of England. Presbyterianism is about setting up an elder structure, to police the hierarchy of the Roman Church, system of church elders, or how to form church elders, which happened to be why the church I was raised in, despite its distinctive Baptist flavor, was Presbyterian in its categorization. In the British Museum, there's a document dating back to 314 of the Common Era, and signed by 3 British bishops, indicating that Christianity had reached England from Scotland and Ireland very early. But it was not until 597 of the Common Era that the Pope of Rome sent Augustus to convert the Saxons and to establish the English branch of the Roman Catholic Church, called the Church of England. Several hundred years later, the English rulers wished to break the power of the Pope Unlike the leaders of the Reformation, they had nothing against the religion of the Pope, but they did object to his political power. And so, in 1534, the heads of the Church of England resolved that the Pope of Rome had no greater authority in England than any other foreign bishop. And from then on, the Church of England had been separated from the Roman Catholic Church. In America, the Church of England is known as the Protestant Episcopal Church. Though the Church of England had broken away from the power of Rome, its beliefs, ritual, and ministry remained almost the same as those of the Roman Catholic Church. But the Protestant sects who tried to break away from Catholicism and its teaching in England, as well as other parts of the world, kept steadily growing, each one differing from the other in some of their beliefs and practices. The followers of one of the most important of these sects were known as the Anabaptists. And in terms of a world government, I, of course, talk for spiritual rule, but there's certain autonomy within religious communities, within regions, that there can be a uniting. So having 60 Muslim majorities, no, that's not necessary. But unless you consider them as provinces and they refer all to the same government, and then there's sort of a cohesion and people can travel in between without worrying about breaking laws. And anyways, the Anabaptists appeared soon after the spread of the teachings of Peter Waldo and his followers. By the time Luther and Zwingli began to organize the Protestant churches, the Anabaptists were already many in number. Yet, for many reasons, Luther and Zwingli did not find in them friends. Particularly because the Anabaptists did not believe in infant baptism, and Luther and Zwingli did. I was raised in a church that did not believe in infant baptism and rebaptized its members, which was actually very common with the Baptists, is that baptism of the water, the Spirit, the fire, whatever they're supposed to reconfirm their faith. It is interesting to us today to read what treatment these Anabaptists received at the hands of the Reformers. Between 1517, when Luther first posted his defiance against indulgences, and 1530, when the teachings of Luther and Zwingli had won over a large following, over 2,000 Anabaptists were executed. And the cruelty with which the Reformers killed the Anabaptists reminds us of the methods of the Inquisition. Because they claim new revelation, like half of the Christians in this country claim that God is speaking to them, rather they're literally treating their feelings as gods. Hounded by both Catholics and Protestants, driven from place to place, killed in prison wherever found, yet their numbers swelled and their teaching spread in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Holland. The Anabaptists were the forerunners of a great number of important Protestant sects, among them the Baptists of today, the Congregationalists, and the Quakers. The Quakers, who arose in England towards the end of the 17th century, and unlike any other Christian sect, in which they had no definite set of beliefs for their members to profess. They also had no clergy and no churches. They believed that the true religion, which they called the inward light, was within the individual, and wherever true believers met, that spot was sacred land. I don't know why that's following repeatedly today. They met in private homes, they met in barns, they met in the open air and in the marketplaces, and their meetings were more like gathering of a group of friends, a society of friends. In fact, that's what they really called themselves, the Society of Friends. The Quakers is only a nickname that clung to them, just as the nickname Methodist clung to another Christian sect. The Quakers were persecuted in England, and many of them migrated to America, but they received no better treatment here until one Quaker, William Penn, started a Quaker colony in what is now Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The Quakers were influenced by the teachings of other sects that came before them, and the multiplication of the Protestant sects continued. Most of these sects are so different from one another that they almost do not seem like branches of the same religion. Others are so much alike that it may be wondered why they are not united in one sect and in one church. Some of the founders of their own, whom they call saints, some have founders of their own, which they call saints, and prophets. Some have sacred scriptures of their own besides the Bible, and some have ways of worship not shared by any of the others. The division of the Protestant sects has gone on since the Reformers until today. There are more than 200 different sects, and the new sects still continue to appear. And Section 7. A lot of the Baptist groups have their own so-called prophets. The American-born sects. In America, every type of Christian is to be found. Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and almost all of the 200 different Protestant sects are represented here. And, as we have seen, with the multiplication of the gods came a multiplication of hatred and struggle between the tribes and families and individuals. Oh, I'm going to have to stop here.